Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of the South Kingstown Town Council. The date is Monday, February 25th. The time is 7:30. Our first order of business is the pledge to the flag. Please rise and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Will the clerk please take the roll?
Council President Collins.
Here.
Council Vice President DeCruz.
Here.
Councilwoman Kelso. Here. Councilman Veely. Here. Councilman McEltee.
Here.
All members are present.
Great. Item 4 on the agenda is the approval of minutes of previous meetings.
Motion to approve agenda item 4A, B, and C.
Second.
So moved. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That motion carries unanimously. Item 5 is the consent agenda.
Make a motion to approve number 5, the consent agenda.
Second.
So moved. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That motion carries as well. Item 6, licenses. They're all on the consent agenda, so that brings us quickly to our public hearings for tonight. Public hearing 7A is to consider proposed amendments to the Town Code, Chapter 10, Motor Vehicles and Traffic, as follows, and you can read along on your agendas there. How are you doing, Mr. Schock?
Good evening. John Schock, Public Services Director. So I just, by way of background, if we just quickly, I got a couple slides for visuals. So what we're proposing tonight are fines, an amendment to the to Chapter 10 for fines of the Town Code for just two bridges. One's Dugaway Bridge Road Bridge, and the other is the Church Street Bridge over here at Saugatucket. So just by way of background again, Dugaway Bridge, northwest corner of town, 42 feet long, single-lane wooden bridge, poor approaches from either end. It was damaged by a FedEx truck back in '09 and replaced in 2011, and after we replaced it, we restricted it to just passenger vehicles and pickup trucks. Again, there's just a locus map on where it is if people aren't familiar. So this is how it currently exists today. We've got signage again prohibiting commercial vehicles and permitting passenger vehicles and pickup trucks. And so you can actually see this is scarring on one of the wood parapet walls where you've got lug nuts from a large truck that has already scarred the bridge since we rebuilt it. And Church Street Bridge, again, right over here off of Columbia Street that crosses the Saugatucket. That's a gravity stone arch bridge, very narrow. It's still two-way traffic, unlike Dugaway, which is single direction. Still very narrow, even for two passenger vehicles to cross at the same time. People need to be careful, but it's really not wide enough for a large truck or a bus and a car. Again, poor geometry. The bridge is canted at an angle. I don't know why they did that back in the 1800s. I guess the horses liked it that way back then. But again, that stone, and the stone parapet walls on that bridge was damaged, I think, back, next slide, Rob, '09 and '11. And again, since we made the parapet wall repairs back in, I think, '16, we've closed that bridge for commercial trucks. So what's happened now is DOT, through Federal Highway, wants us to have weight restrictions for emergency vehicles, and my reluctance is if we post it for emergency vehicles, commercial truck operators will say, well, you know, if a fire truck can make it over, we can too. So in order to deter that, we're proposing fines, post the bridges for emergency vehicles, but have a fine for commercial trucks or vehicles that would hopefully deter those type of vehicles from crossing the bridge, both bridges. And that's what we have before you tonight. And I'd ask favorable consideration to pass the ordinance as amended. So it would be a $500 fine with an additional $2,500 if we would need to inspect the bridge and hire a third-party engineer. So potentially up to a $3,000 fine, which I would think if you're driving a truck or a commercial vehicle would be a pretty good disincentive to try to make an attempt to try to cross the bridge.
I have a quick question. Let's say you're driving a big truck and you're coming up to the Dugway Bridge. Like, what do you, like, once you get there, it's kind of like,
Dugway, we have signage out on 138.
okay,
And we have it, the bridge is very close to Glen Rock Road. So, I mean, you know well in advance that you shouldn't be going down Dugway Bridge Road to try to attempt to cross the bridge.
okay. I was asking because I wasn't sure if there was other signage prior.
We have it well in advance.
Okay.
Any other questions for John? Seems pretty straightforward. Are there any comments from the public on this item? Very good. Do I hear a motion to close the public hearing?
Make a motion that we close the public hearing for item 7A.
Second.
So moved. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
And that motion carries unanimously. Do I hear a motion on 7A?
I'll make a motion that we approve item 7A.
Second.
So moved. Any discussion this time? No. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
And that motion carries. And that brings us to public hearing 7B. This is relative to proposed amendments to the South Kingstown zoning ordinance, Article 1, Establishment of Districts and Official Zoning Map, Article 6, Overlay Zones, Special Zones and Special Management Districts, and Article 12, Definitions relative to coastal community building height, character, and resiliency, as shown on Exhibit 1 attached to the agenda.
Okay. Good evening. I am Chelsea Seifert, Director of Planning, Town of South Kingstown. Tonight's public hearing is on proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance relative to coastal building height, community character, and resiliency. I've prepared a presentation that I hope will help everyone understand the problems at hand and how the Planning Board has proposed to solve them. This is an important issue for South Kingstown, maintaining the character of our coastal communities while increasing our resiliency to coastal storms. It is important that we consider the issue and the implications of the proposed amendments carefully. This proposal is a significant change from current practice. As such, I'll try to give as much information as possible, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go or at the end. In 2018, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a bill which changed the definition of building height within the Zoning Enabling Act. As you know, the Zoning Enabling Act is the controlling legislation for local zoning, and a change to a definition within the Act pushes through to all local zoning ordinances, whether or not municipalities actively amend their ordinances to comply. The new definition of building height, which becomes effective March 1st, changes the way that height is measured within the FEMA-defined special flood hazard areas. Special flood hazard areas, or SFHAs for short, are what we refer to as flood zones. They are the areas in which inundation is predicted for a 100-year storm event. So the first thing that the legislation did was, within SFHAs, building height is now measured from base flood elevation, or BFE. Base flood elevation is the elevation as determined by FEMA on their flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, at which a structure should be constructed to withstand a 100-year storm event. This map provides a snapshot of the FEMA-designated base flood elevations for a section of Green Hill. The red areas are VE zones, and the blue areas are AE zones. Each area has its own BFE, and the VE zones along the coast in this area have BFEs ranging from 15 to 17 feet, and the AE zones range between 12 feet and 14 feet. All new construction and major renovations within flood zones must elevate to the FEMA-required base flood elevation plus 1 foot of freeboard per the state building code. The planning board realized that changing the way building height is measured from BFE rather than from existing elevation could have big implications for the character of our coastal neighborhoods. The effect of this, without amending the zoning ordinance, as proposed, would be the potential for substantially taller buildings within special flood hazard areas. Where the current 35-foot maximum height restriction had to incorporate both the elevated space, as shown here, the 35 feet will now apply only to living space, as shown here. This is an example of a 15-foot base flood elevation, and again, the 35 feet put on top. So you can see the difference. This one, it was, with the 10-foot elevation, it was a 45-foot overall height. 15 feet is a 50-foot overall height. Second thing that the legislation did was to allow applicants to choose to use the CRMC design elevation maps to establish base flood elevation. CRMC had created a series of 5 maps which take into account the effects of future sea level rise on storm surge inundation. The CRMC maps provide structural design elevations, or the elevations to which structures should be designed to withstand storm surge. The new legislation allows building permit applicants to choose one of these maps to establish their BFE, and when chosen, the structural design elevations for all intents and purposes become the base flood elevation for the property. To demonstrate the effect of the CRMC design elevation maps on elevation, let's look at this Green Hill example again. So I've picked one specific property. It shows on FEMA as a base flood elevation of 17 feet. Yeah, absolutely.
Like to work, here we go. So that means that each property could have its own base elevation?
They do.
Like meaning like the one across the street, the one next door?
Correct. And properties can have different base flood elevations.
Right.
They don't follow property lines. It's really where you're putting your structure. So, yeah, these, for some reason, probably because the street is there, this one follows Green Hill Beach Road, right? But if you look even to the east, you'll see there are properties where, you know, the VE zone is on one portion of the lot and then the AE zone is on the other, and it really depends where you put your structure, what your elevation would be. The same property, so at the FEMA, let's go back one. FEMA base flood elevation for that random property I selected is 17 feet. CRMC has a 0-foot sea level rise map. That map, while not depicting future sea level rise conditions, CRMC used a different model to create the scenario than FEMA did, and CRMC believes it to be more accurate. So in this case, for this random property that I selected in Green Hill, CRMC's 0-foot sea level rise actually goes down by 2 feet, from 17 to 15 feet. With 2 feet of sea level rise, the elevation becomes 20 feet. With 5 feet, the elevation goes up to 25 feet. With 7 feet, it goes to 30. And on the 10-foot map, the recommended elevation is 35 feet. Now I'll show you some more examples of this later in the presentation. The elevation of grade here is about 10 feet above sea level. So while it says 35 feet base flood, you subtract that difference from grade, right? So it's sea level rise, grade, and then on top of that. So here at the 10-foot, it would be about 25 feet above grade. But we'll get into that a little bit more later. So the diagram on the right here shows the effect of allowing an applicant to utilize a CRMC map to establish base flood elevation. So we have current, if you use FEMA, and then if you use that new CRMC map. Again, it sort of has that same effect of increasing the overall height of the structure. Now, while the planning board realized that increased building height would certainly change community character, they also realized that even without the change to state law, coastal community character is changing. It's changing simply by the fact that structures are now required to elevate. Elevated structures are not necessarily commonplace in South Kingstown's coastal communities, but all new structures and significant renovations will be required to be elevated. So if you take this home as an example, while it's not representative necessarily of what we might see in South Kingstown's coastal neighborhoods, you can see how the character changes simply by elevating the structure. Where this picture, it is simply a ranch-style home, which might fit in fine in a residential neighborhood. When it's elevated, it seems a little bit out of place. And it was this realization that got the planning board thinking about the character of our coastal communities in general, and not just limiting excessive building height. We started the conversation by looking at different examples of elevated structures, so that we could get a feel for what the structural forms reflected South Kingstown's character, and which ones did not. The board liked this, but not this, even though those buildings are approximately the same height above grade. They liked this, but not this. Again, even though the structures are more or less the same height above grade. And so the board began considering what standards, in addition to reducing building height, might be appropriate for the special flood hazard areas. The board was careful not to attempt to dictate architectural style, but rather to consider subtle changes to the massing, or the building blocks of the structure, that would make an impact on character. And after multiple months of discussion, the planning board developed the proposed amendments. The amendments seek to do three specific things: limit excessive building height, retain as much of the coastal character as possible, and increase resiliency in coastal areas. The proposed amendments create 2 new overlay districts within the zoning ordinance. The focus of the amendments is on the new Special Flood Hazard Area Overlay District, shown here in the darker blue shade. It is within the Special Flood Hazard Area Overlay District where the relevant height, character, and resiliency standards come into play. There currently exists within the zoning ordinance a high flood danger overlay district, shown here in red, which lies entirely within the proposed SFHA district. To limit confusion, the proposed amendments integrate the applicable standards of the HFD district into the new district and eliminate the high flood danger overlay district altogether. The proposed amendments also create a coastal resiliency overlay district, shown here in green. The CR overlay district encompasses the area that CRMC believes will be inundated during a 100-year storm, given 5 feet of sea level rise. The entirety of that overlay district lies outside of the proposed SFHA district. The CR overlay district is intended to be informational and educational only. The proposed amendments require applicants for building permits for structures that lie within the zone to visit the planning department and receive information about how future sea level rise might inundate or might impact their property. The information is then to be recorded in the town's land evidence record so that future property owners will be made aware of the future scenarios. This process is modeled from a process recommended by CRMC within their beach SAMP, Special Area Management Plan. Of note, the height and dimensional standards do not apply to improvements within the commercial, industrial, and government institutional zoning districts. An overlay district lies on top of the underlying zoning district. The proposed amendments specifically state the dimensional and form standards do not apply to projects within these underlying zoning districts. The reason for this was that the board was was able to consider how elevating structures would impact residential neighborhoods, but had a harder time determining how elevating structures would affect commercial, industrial, and government institutional uses. In this respect, and generally, when discussing whether more detailed standards were appropriate, the board wanted input from subject matter experts, architects, marine engineers, and others, but didn't have the time nor the resources to engage such services. Relative to these zoning districts, the board thought it best to simply make the new standards not apply so that they could potentially address these areas in the future. Operationally, the proposed amendments use a new definition of development project to determine when the standards apply and when they don't. The planning board thought it was important to define the threshold at which an improvement or construction project would be required to adhere to the new standards. The standards apply to new construction of structures that are intended for occupancy, substantial improvement of a structure as determined by the building official using the building code, repair or renovation of a structure substantially damaged in a storm event as determined by the building official, and all cumulative improvements which have the effect of bringing the total value of all improvements to 50% or more of the value of the structure. Any type of improvement that doesn't meet this definition does not require application of the standards. The maximum building height for residential structures within the SFHA overlay district is reduced. New maximum building heights are established based on how high the BFE is above existing grade. As shown before, the diagram on the left shows the current way building height is measured, starting from grade, and the second diagram shows the effect of the change in the definition. The planning board proposes bringing the maximum height of buildings elevated to a BFE of 10 feet or less above grade to 25 feet, which is depicted on the right. 25 feet will allow for 2 stories of living space, plus roof pitch, and potentially small attic spaces. For buildings elevated to a BFE of greater than 10 feet above grade, maximum building height is proposed at 18 feet. The diagram on the right shows a structure elevated to a BFE of 15 feet. 18 feet will allow for a story and a half. The changes to maximum building height do reduce the height of living space in some cases. Where some properties with a low BFE may have been able to fit 3 stories within the previous 35 height limitation and elevate as required, they will now be required to keep the 25-foot maximum, which is roughly equivalent to 2 stories. In this example, a structure with a 2-foot elevation, which under the current rules could be built to 35 feet, will only be allowed a maximum of 27 feet. Other properties with moderate BFEs, which may have been able to obtain 2 stories within the previous 35-foot height limitation, will now be limited to no more than 18 feet, which is roughly equivalent to 1.5 stories. In this example, a structure with a 12-foot elevation, which might have been able to put 2 stories in under the 35-foot height limit, is allowed only 18 feet for a total height of 30 feet. These reductions are a result of trying to minimize excessive building heights and the need to draw a line in the height differential somewhere. The board felt it important to keep most structures under the existing 35-foot height limit wherever possible, and so drew the line at the 10-foot mark. Projects within the SFHA overlay district use a floor area ratio, or FAR, to determine maximum building size. In all other places within the zoning ordinance, maximum building size is determined using the building height number, minimum setbacks, maximum building lot coverage figure, and other related requirements, such as the provision of parking. These figures together give the 3-dimensional space the building can occupy, and therefore loosely the maximum building size. This example shows a non-conforming lot with 50 feet of frontage and 100 feet of depth. These lots are fairly typical throughout our coastal areas. In this example, when you apply the building coverage figure, subtract the area necessary for accessory structures such as decks and porches, and apply it to a 2-story building, you get a structure that contains approximately 1,600 square feet of living space. The The building footprint then has to be placed within the building envelope, shown here in orange, which is created by the required setbacks. It is difficult to predict the size of buildings using these standards, and the board felt it would detract from the coastal community character to allow large buildings on the many small lots that exist in our coastal areas. The board felt it was important that structure sizes in the coastal areas be proportional to property size, which is an approach that can help maintain community character. As discussed earlier, it isn't only excessive height that the board felt would threaten our coastal communities, but also the overall size and massing of structures. Using a floor area ratio can help better predict building size and allow greater control of form and massing. Within the SFHA overlay district, a maximum FAR is given based on elevation above grade. The floor area ratio is applied to the lot size to determine the gross floor area, or GFA. Structures elevated to a BFE of 10 feet or less above grade apply a 30% FAR to determine GFA. And structures elevated to a BFE greater than 10 feet apply a 20% FAR to determine gross floor area. Using the same parcel as an example, a structure elevated to 10 feet or less above grade would be allowed 1,500 square feet of living space, while a structure elevated to more than 10 feet above grade would be allowed 1,000 square feet of living space. In addition to more specifically regulating building size, the use of FAR gives better control over the form and massing of structures. For two-story buildings, which are those with a BFE 10 feet or less above grade, an FAR ratio is used to minimize the aesthetic effect of larger buildings. For these buildings, a maximum of 60% of the gross floor area may be provided on the first floor, and the remainder is to be provided on the second floor. The second floor must always be no more than 2/3 of the footprint of the first floor. The ratio gives structures a bit more variation and stops the feeling of having a wall of structure on the street. You have a bit of a step back, you have some difference on that second story. The extra space can be provided simply as a step back, or it could be incorporated into an architectural feature, such as an integrated deck. Since decks are not included in the gross floor area, a separate maximum deck area figure is provided. Each parcel may have a deck or decks no larger than 15% of the maximum calculated gross floor area. In this example, the property would be allowed 225 square feet of deck space, which is approximately a 10-foot by 22.5-foot deck. Integrated second-story decks, or those that are above the first floor of living space, are not included in the maximum area, and that was done as an attempt to incentivize more variation in the form and massing of the structures. The proposed amendments include several other dimensional standards that are applicable regardless of how high a building is elevated above grade. One thing that the planning board felt was important to preserve were view corridors to the ocean from streets. To do this, the proposed amendments require each side setback to be 25% of the lot width rather than a static number. This will provide wider side yard setbacks where they can be accommodated given the width of lots. Given this increased side yard setback requirement, the proposed amendments allow up to 3 feet of roof overhangs and 2 feet of normal projections for fireplace, chimneys, and windows to extend into the side yard setback. Such projections are not currently allowed to encroach side yard setbacks. Where lots have rear lot lines abutting a coastal feature, the proposed amendments allow the front setback to be the average setback of those parcels located within 250 feet of the parcel on the same side of the street. The intent of this standard is to increase resiliency by pulling structures as far from the coastal feature as possible without drastically altering the character of the surrounding neighborhood. This would also reflect actual development characteristics within neighborhoods where dimensionally nonconforming front yard setbacks are typical. The proposed amendments require a minimum roof pitch of 4 to 12. Greater roof pitches are allowed, depending on what can be accommodated within the maximum building height. The intent of this requirement is to prohibit flat roofs, which the planning board felt would detract from the coastal community character. In the same vein, roof decks are also prohibited. First floor entrances must be serviced by a porch, deck, or other landing of a minimum of 6 feet in depth. This requirement provides articulation and a place to pause when unlocking doors, bringing in groceries, and the like. Finally, all structural walls exceeding 24 feet in length, which face a public right-of-way, are required to demonstrate some facade articulation. The articulation must have a width of a minimum of 6 feet and a depth of at least 1 foot, and the 6-foot width may be split up into multiple features if preferred. These are some examples of how that might be accomplished. I'll note here again that the planning board was interested in getting some additional assistance with this concept, perhaps from an architect, so that the regulation could be more effective. The planning board also realized that there are several parcels within the SFHA overlay district which currently contain more than one principal structure, such as this parcel on Jerry Brown Farm Road, and that more such parcels may be created in the future. The proposed amendments clarify how FAR is applied to these parcels. The parcels within the overlay district share the maximum gross floor area equally, and structures that are not in the overlay district are not subject to the GFA requirement. Now, allowing building permit applicant to use CRMC's design elevation maps, there's a bit of complication into the regulatory process. As discussed earlier, applicants can choose between 5 different CRMC maps, including a map that is planning for 10 feet of sea level rise. Use of a CRMC map to establish base flood elevation could have substantial impacts on community character. And while the use of the maps is intended to increase resiliency, proposers will be elevating their structures based on likely future conditions, given sea level rise, and therefore will be more resilient. The planning board was concerned that applicants may choose a higher sea level rise scenario simply to take advantage of a better view to the water body. To illustrate the vast differences in height that are available, let's look again at the previous example from Green Hill. The FEMA firm requires elevation of that property to 17 feet above sea level rise. The grade in that location is elevated 10 feet above sea level. Got a little person in there to give you a sense of scale. The Rhode Island Building Code requires 1 foot of freeboard on top of what FEMA requires, which is shown here in purple, meaning that a structure elevated to the required FEMA firm base flood elevation would be 8 feet off the ground. With the new height regulations we already discussed, this house would be allowed 25 feet of building height, bringing the total height above grade to 33 feet. The CRMC 0-foot sea level rise design elevation map suggests that structures in this location be elevated to 15 feet above sea level or 5 feet above existing grade. This is actually a reduction in height from the FEMA firm requirements and would not be allowed under the building code. With 2 feet of sea level rise, the CRMC design elevation map suggests a structure in this location be elevated to 20 feet above sea level, or 10 feet above existing grade. At 10 feet, they would still be allowed 25 feet of building height, bringing the total height to 35 feet above grade. With 5 feet of sea level rise, CRMC's map suggests a structure in this location be elevated to 25 feet above sea level, or 15 feet above existing grade. At 15 feet above grade, they would be limited to 18 feet of building height, bringing the total height to 33 feet above grade. 7 feet of sea level rise, CRMC's maps suggest 20 feet of elevation. Total height would be 38 feet. 10 feet of sea level rise, the elevation map suggests structures be elevated to 35 feet above sea level, or 25 feet above grade. This would bring the total height of the building to 43 feet. To reduce the likelihood that a CRMC design elevation map would be used by an applicant simply to obtain a better view, the planning board proposes requiring a special use permit for any project proposing to use one of CRMC's maps. A special use permit will also be required for new or replacement structures within the Coastal Community Overlay District, which encompasses the coastal cottage communities. The intent of requiring a special use permit is to ensure that building permit applicants are considering all aspects of resiliency given the sea level rise scenario that they have selected. Therefore, the criteria for obtaining the special use permit are all based on ensuring the applicant has considered the implications of sea level rise, including land inundation, adequate access, treatment of wastewater, availability of potable water, and construction resiliency. The first standard that must be met is that the structure will maintain land-based, adequate vehicular access to US Route 1 along an existing roadway, with the amount of sea level rise depicted on the selected design elevation map. There are properties throughout town that, while not themselves subject to sea level rise inundation, would lose vehicular access to Route 1 given sea level rise. This is the 5-foot sea level rise scenario for the same section of Green Hill we looked at previously. The properties in this area, while not inundated by 5 feet of sea level rise, lose access to Route 1 because Green Hill Beach Road will be inundated. These properties, therefore, would not meet the special use permit criteria using the 5-foot sea level rise design elevation map and would only be able to use the 2-foot map. And you can see here with 2 feet of sea level rise, Green Hill Beach Road is not inundated, and therefore they could use the 2-foot map to establish their BFE. The second standard is that the footprint of the proposed structure must lie completely outside of any land area that is below the mean high water mark with the projected amount of sea level rise. This map depicts inundation with 1 foot of sea level rise. If we look at the properties along the west side of Green Hill Beach Road, we see that many of the properties have sufficient room between the sea level rise inundation area and the roadway to construct a dwelling. However, as the inundation increases to 2 feet of sea level rise, and then 5 feet, the available area for a structure decreases. This standard is intended to make applicants consider not only which sea level rise scenario they should be planning for, but also where on their property is the best location for their structure. There are 2 separate standards that deal with utilities. Applicants must demonstrate that the structure will be serviced by an approved on-site wastewater treatment system that will function compliantly with the projected amount of sea level rise. They do this by submitting a statement from a wastewater certified civil engineer. Applicants must also demonstrate that the structure will be adequately serviced by public potable water or a private potable water supply with the projected amount of sea level rise. For many parcels, CRMC has not only recommended a design elevation for structures, but also given the new flood zone in which the structure will be located, given the amount of sea level rise shown on the map. The special use permit requires construction to the standard of the new flood zone. This map depicts the current flood zones as determined by FEMA. The red areas are VE zones, and the blue areas are AE zones. With 5 feet of sea level rise, CRMC predicts that these areas, which are now in an AE zone, will transition to a VE zone. This map depicts CRMC's anticipated flood zones. The coloration is the same as the previous map. A VE zone requires a higher level of construction standards than an AE zone in order to account for more intense wave action and wind. The planning board wanted to ensure that structures were as resilient as possible, given changing conditions. And while I don't know very much about construction methods, I know Wayne is here, so he can answer questions if you have them. Finally, for properties that lie within CRMC's jurisdiction, which is 200 feet from the coastal feature, the special use permit requirements include receipt of a preliminary determination from CRMC. The preliminary determination verifies that CRMC has signed off on the project, including the selected sea level rise scenario. In some cases, CRMC will issue recommendations along with the preliminary determination, which would be important for the zoning board to have in hand when issuing an approval. So that wraps up all of the proposed changes contained within the amendments. One additional thing, which I realized I neglected to include a little bit too late in the process, is that the HFD overlay district, which the amendments propose to eliminate, still shows up in the use table, which is found in section 301 of the zoning ordinance. Should the council feel it appropriate to adopt the proposed amendments or some version of the proposed amendments which includes elimination of the HFD overlay district, I respectfully request that you also remove the HFD overlay district column from the table contained within section 301. I also had a chance to review the letter Correspondence from John Kenyon representing his clients Richard Rudman and Karen Greenberg Rudman. And I wanted to touch base on that quickly. Based on the information provided, I was able to locate the property in question, which I believe is the one shown here. The letter indicates that the base flood elevation is 17 feet above sea level, which equates to 10.3 feet above average existing grade. The Rhode Island Building Code requires them to utilize a minimum of 1 foot of freeboard, which would bring their elevated space to 11.3 feet above grade. Under the current regulations, they would be permitted up to 23.7 feet of height for their livable space, for a total of 35 feet. They are correct in asserting that this would, under the proposed regulations, limit them to a maximum building height of 18 feet. As discussed earlier, the board realized that under the proposed amendments, some properties would be permitted less building height than currently allowed. The 10-foot or less threshold was decided in an attempt to keep as many buildings under the 35-foot height as possible. Relative to the size of their proposed house, the figure provided in the letter states that it is lot coverage. The letter states that the proposed home has a lot coverage of 1,606 square feet. Lot coverage is the percentage of the lot occupied by the building. It does not tell you how many stories the structure is, nor how much living space is proposed. With 1,606 square feet of lot coverage, it is possible that the structure could have 2 stories at 1,606, which would make the structure 3,212 square feet. I don't know if that's true, but it would be possible. I believe the planning board would consider that a very large house. It seems that the letter also misunderstands the side yard setback requirement. The side yard setback requirement is equal to 25% of the lot width. Correct. But lot width is not calculated as the width of the largest portion of the property. The definition of lot width within the zoning ordinance is the horizontal distance between the sidelines of a lot measured at right angles to its depth along a straight line parallel to the front lot line at the minimum front yard setback. What that means in lay terms is you take your frontage line, which is on the road, you measure down your front yard setback, and whatever the width is at that point, that is your lot width. This property, the lot width would be measured 35 feet from the frontage on Matunic Schoolhouse Road, and the lot width would be 50 feet. In this specific case, the side yard setback would be only 12.5 feet, not 100 feet. The limitation on deck size is due to the use of FAR to calculate building size, rather than lot coverage. As discussed earlier, when lot coverage is used, the lot coverage figure, which is typically 20%, includes not only the principal dwelling, but also accessory structures. When using an FAR, if a maximum deck allowance is not included, the entire lot could be covered in decking, as FAR only pertains to living space. It seems that the letter also misinterprets how maximum deck allowance is calculated. The standard states, deck shall be no greater in size than 15% of the calculated GFA, not the proposed GFA. Each lot is allowed 15% of the maximum GFA as deck space. On this lot, given that it is 5 acres in size and at a 10.3 BFE above grade, they would be allowed a maximum of 1,306 square feet of deck. If the language of this section is not clear, I would suggest adding the word maximum to section 601.7A3 so that it reads as follows. Deck shall be no greater in size than 15% of the calculated maximum GFA, as that was the intent of the planning board. Given this, it seems the only valid concern in the letter is the loss of allowable height. And again, the planning board considered this concern and deemed it appropriate to limit height for anything elevated to a BFE over 10 feet above grade to 18 feet in height, due to the need to generally minimize the height of buildings in the SFHA. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Does this take into account, could you park underneath the house, as an example, with breakaway walls?
That is a question for Wayne.
The reason why I asked that question is because I've seen some houses that are that have breakaway walls that have been turned into living space?
All right, I'll address that. Wayne Pimentel, the building official for the town. In flood zones and VE zones, the only area you're allowed to use below the BFE is for parking, storage of 300 square feet or less, and building access. They are required to have breakaway walls, and they're not allowed to have any habitable space. All mechanicals, utilities have to be elevated above the BFE as well. You're welcome.
I just want to point out that I have recused from this. I own some property in one of the zones, so I won't be participating in the conversation or discussion. Thank you.
Can you talk more about the second floor height restriction? Not height, sorry, living space
The ratio?
ratio.
Yes.
Just,
So the ratio is intended to provide some variation to the second floor. So you have you have your gross floor area number, let's say it's 1,000 square feet for roundness. 600 of those square feet could be on the first floor, and 400 would have to be on the second floor. The intent of that was really to provide some variation on that second floor, because when the planning board looked at the examples of elevated structures and what they liked and didn't like, they didn't like a wall of building, 2 stories high, elevated and then a wall of building. And so we tried to incorporate something, a couple of standards that would say, well, you can't just have a wall of building, you have to put some architectural variation into that building design.
And is that the same reason for the roof pitch?
Roof pitch was also a coastal community character standard. If you look throughout town, even not in our coastal neighborhoods, you don't see a lot of flat residential roofs.
Yeah, that's because of snow here.
Because of snow, right? And so that sort of snow determination has crafted our character over time so that when we look at our residential neighborhoods, they all have, pitched roofs.
but there could be some nice designs out there that have flat roofs too.
Could be, right?
Great. Other questions from here at the table? Obviously, very complex issue. I want to thank the planning board for undertaking all the thought. Is there a correspondence from the planning board that we need to enter into the record?
Yeah, and I would just like to acknowledge that Maria Mack, our planning board chair, is in the audience. If you have any more specific questions or things you want to address her about.
Perhaps she can come up during the comment section.
We did receive a letter dated January 24th from the planning board indicating that at their meeting held on Tuesday, January 22nd, the board voted to recommend that the council enact revisions to the zoning ordinance as detailed in Exhibit 1 and the zoning map, both of which are indicated on the agenda this evening. And we will also acknowledge the letter that was received late this afternoon from Attorney John Kenyon on behalf of his clients, Richard Rudman and Karen Greenberg Rudman, expressing concerns regarding adoption of these proposed amendments.
Thank you. All right, at this time, we'll invite folks to come up from the public. It's sort of first come, first serve here. Just state your name for the record.
Good evening, I'm John Kenyon. I'm here tonight representing Richard Rudman and Karen Greenberg Rudman. My clients own property at 204B Indigo Point Road. The property's in an R80 zoning district, and it's 5.2 acres in size, so it's probably one of the larger parcels that would be affected by this. My client's been working for several years with architects, engineers, biologists to redesign their existing house They purchased the house in 2012. It did not meet FEMA requirements. They've redesigned it so it meets the flood zone requirements. It also met all of today's zoning ordinance requirements. They received an OWTS approval from Rhode Island DEM. They also received a preliminary determination from CRMC that they could construct what they were proposing. We actually met last week with Wayne just to verify that we met the zoning ordinance requirements, and then we found out about this proposed ordinance. I've spent the last week trying to compare what they were doing with this proposed ordinance to determine whether it complied or not. I want to thank Ms. Seifert for explaining some of the errors I had in reading this proposed ordinance. I think the decks being based on the maximum calculation makes a lot of sense. The setback helps my clients because their property is what's called a hockey stick lot. So there's only a 50-foot stretch that goes out to the road. In the past, some zoning officials have not calculated the side yard setback the way that Chelsea explained it, which I think is the correct way. So as long as it's being calculated like that, then it isn't a problem. It does worry me that there are other properties out there that aren't hockey stick lots that are 400 or 500 feet wide that are going to have 100-foot side yard setbacks that are going to interfere with moving a proposed house further from an environmentally sensitive area. A lot of times in these areas, we're going to the zoning board requesting front yard setbacks and side yard setbacks to move the house as far from the water as possible. My concern is if you increase those setbacks, it's going to make it even more difficult. At this time, I'd like to have Mr. Rudman come up, and maybe he can just go over the past 3 years, what they've been doing, what they were proposing. As I stated, what they had designed meets all the flood zone requirements. It meets today's zoning ordinance requirements. While I agree with, I'm glad they're using the gross floor area limitations based on lot size. I agree with the FAR calculations, and those don't necessarily impact my client as much as the height limitation, which in their case, they're one of the lots that actually has a lower height requirement. They could go up to 35 feet today, and under this ordinance, they'd be limited to approximately 29 feet. So Richard, you want to?
Good evening. My name is Richard Rudman. I'm here with my wife Karen. We're not used to being the center of attention at a zoning hearing, but I think it may help to tell our story and talk a little bit about our situation, because I think there are probably other people who are in a similar situation and other people who will be in a similar situation in the future. We have had a home in South Kingstown for 21 years. For a long time, we had a home on Ministerial Road near Larkin Pond, and in 2012, we sold that and moved to a house on Green Hill Pond. We were thinking ahead to retirement and wanted to be near the water. When we bought the house, we knew that it was going to be at risk of sea level rise. The house is got concrete walls on the ground level, and if and when the ocean comes over Green Hill Beach, we're going to have potentially in storms waves against that concrete wall, and that we know is not a good thing. So when we bought the house, our plan was to rebuild the house, elevating it above the FEMA flood level, and having a house that we could retire in. We've been working with an architect and an engineer to design the house. I know that Ms. Seifert said that at least the planning board would think what we're proposing is a very large house. It is a total of 700 feet larger than what we bought and is under 3,000 feet. Hard to imagine retiring and living the rest of our lives in something that's a lot smaller than that. The house that we designed is 34 feet above grade. The house is elevated above grade 10.3 feet so that it's above the FEMA flood level. And we've done research with the CRMC plans, and there's certainly scenarios out there where you'd want a house that is taller. But we're pretty confident that the house that we've designed is going to last for the rest of our natural lives, and probably some years after that. We've gone most of the way through our permitting process. We've got our septic approval for a new denitrification system. We've got the preliminary determination from CRMC, and it was literally when we were going to see Wayne Pimental to get the letter that you need to file the final determination application, which says you comply with zoning, that we learned about the proposed new amendments. I understand there may be some issues about how much of the new amendments make it impossible to build our house, but certainly for the height limitation. It makes us impossible to build our house, and I think it makes it impossible for anyone in our situation to reinvest in their property and make it more resilient to flood. Our neighbors are 35-foot buildings. We actually would be 34 feet with a flat roof. Our neighbors have flat roofs. There are many flat roofs in the neighborhood. Just taking a look at my notes here. For us, if this zoning passes and we're limited to building one floor, frankly, it's not economically feasible, because to have a house of the size that we would need to live in, you're building a much bigger footprint, and you're building a much bigger foundation. The foundation size going from 2 stories to 1 story doubles. The foundation for a flood-resistant house is very expensive. And the idea that you can readily convert 2 stories up to 1 story that is a much larger footprint economically doesn't make sense, because the foundation costs just make it prohibitive to build. What I think we will do, the decision that we will make, is either we sell the property to someone who doesn't believe in climate change, which I think is, we wouldn't feel good about that, or we're living in the house that we've got until it gets knocked over by the ocean. And we're not doing what we could do and what we want to do to make it flood resistant. Maybe we can't, certainly within 35 feet, make it flood resistant forever, but we can make it flood resistant for another 30, 40, 50 years. And none of us know what the world is going to look like that far out. So I have a lot of respect for what the planning board has tried to do, and there's certainly a very serious issue here about this new state statute and people being able to build above 35 feet. But what I really suggest is, at least as a start, that these new rules don't apply to a house that is 35 feet above grade or less. That the planning board and this council shouldn't be making decisions because of the state statute that are now, well, we like this kind of house, we don't like that kind of house. We think because some people may be able to build 40 feet, we're going to keep other people building only to 28 feet. And you're going to end up with a lot of houses that are deteriorating, that people are living in. Maybe they don't want to live in them, but they'll rent them, and just waiting for the ocean to come take them away. And I don't think that is good for building community character. So I'd suggest first that these new rules, if they're going to be adopted, not apply to houses that are within the current building height. And I guess I'd ask if that's not acceptable, at least for my wife and I and anyone who is in exactly our situation, that at least there be a transition rule if you've started the permitting process. If you've got some of your permits and you're working the way through, at least let us complete our permitting and build our house based on the old rules, because we're not building anything that is of the height that people are concerned about. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
To follow up on the last comment, that would also, because under the current rules, you can't build more than 35 feet. So if there was a savings clause for those applicants who have begun and are along the permitting process, they would have to be under 35 feet. So that would solve some of the concerns, unless they were going for a height variance. But if you're going through coastal, received the preliminary determination, and received notification from the building official that you comply with today's zoning ordinance, then you should be able to move forward under the regulations as of today, and you wouldn't have to be concerned about the houses being over the 35 feet.
So, John, if an applicant wanted to change their plans that had already been approved by CRMC, they could do so, but CRMC would have to approve revised plans, correct?
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you. Seems to have some valid concerns there, and certainly some people are going to be pinched by the new regulations as they are proposed at this point. How hard would it be to add a clause like that tonight?
I think this, the draft that you have before you tonight represents, as Chelsea indicated, several months of study by the planning board and by staff. I would not suggest that either of those proposed suggestions be added on the fly, because I would think, and I would ask Chelsea to agree or disagree, that the planning department might want to study the effect. In other words, how many how many properties would be affected by either of those suggestions. So in theory, yes, if the council wants to include an exemption in this ordinance, for example, for applicants who have already begun the permitting process with CRMC, that wouldn't take an incredible amount of study, but I would suggest it's something that probably shouldn't be done tonight on the fly.
So, Amy, is it imperative that we pass or vote on this tonight?
So, and I'll let Chelsea speak to this as well, but if the town does nothing, right, if we don't take any action on this ordinance, and our current building height definition is superseded by the new definition in state law, which will take effect on March 1st, unless something miraculously happens before then. And this regulatory scheme will not be in place. The council could if the council defers action on this, someone could put in a building permit application on March 1st. Mr. Kenyon's clients could put in a building permit application and be allowed to build to as high as state law will allow. I don't think there's a good way to predict how many applications would come, for example, if you continued this until the end of March, I don't think there's a good way to predict how many applicants would come in during that time. I'll leave it to Chelsea and perhaps Maria to give you their thoughts on whether it's imperative for the council to act on this, but the answer is, if the town doesn't adopt this proposed draft, then property owners will be able to put in building permit applications for structures like the simple graphical examples that were depicted on Chelsea's presentation, and that may or may not be something you want to allow either in general or even for a short period of time.
Could we make an amendment after the fact?
Absolutely, yeah, you can change this at any time. So if that is something you'd like to, for example, if the council thinks it's appropriate to adopt this draft as presented to you, with the correction on eliminating the high flood danger overlay from the use table, and perhaps inserting that word maximum to clarify deck size, and further direct that the planning department and planning board study the suggested exemptions to this ordinance, that's something that the process can start immediately, and it would have to be renoticed, re-advertised as a zoning ordinance amendment, but I wouldn't think that would, again, that wouldn't require many months of study. That, I think, would come back to you fairly quickly.
So if we pass this tonight in the way it is, but yet the extension happens, what are the, I guess?
I would advise, assume that the state law is what it is now and will not be changing, if at all, until the end of the legislative session. And if it does happen to change before March 1st, in other words, if this week the governor signs a change to state law postponing the effect of the new building height definition from March 1st to September 1st or some other date in the future, then I think the council should revisit what we've adopted and perhaps make our effective date coincide with the effective date of the state law.
I guess I would characterize it, Councilman, as we're sort of damned if we do and damned if we don't.
Right.
If we pass the ordinance tonight and the state statute effective date changes, then the underlying authorization for tonight's ordinance has evaporated. So it has no effect. If we don't pass the ordinance tonight and the extension doesn't happen, then there's no limit to height, essentially.
Right.
We're in an awkward situation.
And I think part of it is, and maybe I'm the only one that feels this way, or maybe there are others, timing. It's the 25th, and we have like 3 days.
I will say that if we have an ordinance locally, we have control over amendments to that ordinance. If we're at the mercy of the state, we don't have nearly as much control or ability to adjust as good suggestions come in, as ideas from the community evolve.
Right.
And would they be able to seek a variance from the zoning regulation?
So part of this regulatory scheme requires a special use permit for certain development, for much of the development that would be proposed in this zone. And under our current zoning ordinance, except for a few specific exceptions to this general rule, property owners are not allowed to seek a variance in conjunction with the special use permit. That's something that has come up in other contexts. I know several months ago, the council recently approved a zoning ordinance amendment allowing property owners to seek a variance in conjunction with the special use permit for OWTS systems. When the council adopted the ordinance governing solar farms, variances are allowed in conjunction with special use permits for solar development. So there are some types of applications for which you can seek both forms of relief, but the general rule is, no, you cannot seek a variance from the dimensional regulations if you are also required to obtain a special use permit.
So in the case that we've heard tonight, the OWTS could be the subject of a variance if needed, as well as the special use permit. Height would not be an eligible variance at this point.
Just to clarify, I believe that the Redmonds do not require a special use permit because they are elevating to the FEMA map, not to the CRMC maps. So if they needed a variance for height, they could apply for one. Also for side yard setback, they could apply for one. And I just also wanted to note that sort of the height, right, where we got the 25 feet and the 18 feet and how it's capped at 10 and all of those numbers, originated really from this idea that the maximum height should be 35 and that heights vary underneath that. Now, if the council thought that that 35-foot height limitation was not a strict cap and was willing to or wanted the planning board to consider 40 feet as a generally okay height, that direction should be given back too. So, and that's really what happened with the Redmonds. They had, the 10 foot plus 25 is 35 feet. And then everything else just fell out of that, right? If you're not at 10 feet, you're above 10 feet. If you don't have 25, if you have less than 25, you have to have 18 because it's a story and a half. And that was all based on that sort of 35 rough number. So again, if you're considering things that you want the planning board to study further, if the council doesn't feel that a 35-foot max is a hard limit, then that's something that should be given back to the board to digest.
Thank you.
Good evening, council members. Maria Mack, Planning Board Chair. I would hope that the council understands the constraints and the legislative mandate that we were dealing with. I think that the Planning Board made a very studious, balanced approach to this. And we, unlike other communities that have essentially drawn a line in the sand, tried to think about potential outcomes and really study this as thoroughly as possible. That said, I think that we have understood all along that this may require some modifications going forward. I certainly was not aware of the Redmonds situation or the letter until just this evening. However, if there are areas in which the council would like us to study, we would be more than happy to do so. I certainly agree with legal counsel's concerns on this matter.
Thank you.
Are there other comments from the public on this item? Any questions here at the, nope, there he is, sorry.
Jim O'Neill, Matunic. What's interesting about this discussion, I went to every single one of the legislative committee meetings, starting with Freeboard 3 years ago, converting to building height, now converting to this. The major concern of every community along the shoreline was the height. I really like the massing idea we've done here, but it was always the height that was the greatest concern by all the reps up there on the committee. And I was just reading a couple of things of our neighbors here, like Narragansett. Let's see if I can find the right spot here. Just to read here, to quote. The problem, according to Narragansett officials, is that a hypothetical structure determined to be in a SFHA with a BFE of 15 feet, in theory, could have a building height start to be counted at 15 feet off the ground, which could result in a structure of 50 feet. And it goes from there. So they passed their ordinance just really to negate what the House has given us. Charlestown, the same thing, our two neighbors here, regarding building height. Response to the change in the state definition of building height, the potential to allow very high buildings in the coastal flood zone, creating a wall along the coast in the most sensitive areas, blocking views, creating additional hazards in the event of severe storms. And they finish by change the zoning ordinance to keep the current height restrictions in the flood hazard areas as they are, max 35 feet. So here are two neighbors who probably could use the extra time to work through this, but the height issue is the one thing that's bothering everybody, my clientele and folks that live along the coastline. And the big worry for us is the people behind the folks who are going to be changing the front line, and very difficult. And I know with 3 days to go that this is not a way to do business, unfortunately. And I think where a lot of the confusion is, and I certainly fall in that category, is I always thought this was going to be an issue about land that has not been already improved. So we're hearing tonight about reinvestment, and there will be a ton of reinvestment along the shoreline. A lot of homes are, even the newer homes, 10, 20, but 40 and 50 years old. So it seems to me that a lot of the arguments here in the conversation has missed the fact that this will be a lot of redo of current buildings, where all my experience up at the legislative committee meetings, everyone was talking about those very difficult lots. And now all of a sudden with the pilings, a lot of the discussion has changed. So I keep thinking of taking my grandchildren to see the Disney's movies, the Transformers, and it all comes to light. Thank you.
Good evening, Jocelyn Luskin-Matunik. First of all, I want to thank Chelsea. She did a great job interpreting what I heard from the planning board. I attended a good portion of the planning board meetings, not as many as I would like to, but I travel for work. I'm a little frustrated by the time zone. I think I heard everyone else say that tonight as well. March 1st is going to come quick. We don't have a comp plan that's current. We have an expired comp plan. But even looking at our expired comprehensive plan, this plan, the planning board proposed plan, fits well into our sense of place and what the community has asked as a design for our coastal villages. I did ask the question to the planning board, if this is passed at the town council level, can changes be made moving forward? And I think I heard legal counsel state that it could be, that they could be. I believe that the planning board, and Maria in particular, stated that yes, that they would be open to consideration, but it's imperative to pass this now to protect our future and to protect our coastline. So I would ask that you pass what has been presented to you now, and then send some directives and some thoughts forward for future consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't see a second, Mr. President, so I'll take advantage of it. Let me just give you a couple numbers here. House Bills 7651, 7695, 5573, 5475A, 5181, 6172A, 5850, 7741A, 7866, and today's 5484. This is what has come at our town and the coastal communities in the last 4 years by powerful representatives up in the General Assembly. Our reps have been almost unanimous with no votes over this period of time. We've lost most of those votes, somewhere between 55 and 60 to 10 to 15 votes. That gives you an idea. Most of the folks voting on this don't live in coastal areas, so it's very easy for them to pass anything up there by the very powerful leader, Mr. Mattiello and team. But this is what our reps have had to deal with year after year. And right now, this bill, and I hope you do pass it tonight, but this particular amount of bills of what they have had to fight time and time again. We lose. We're not going to win. But what our reps have tried to do, and especially Mrs. McEntee, Representative McEntee, who has been at the forefront here, she got the delay to March 1, when this bill was really all set to go through last year after it was passed in June. She has a bill in now to extend this to September 1, another 6 months. But this is just simply incredible. But her job and all of our representatives' jobs up there is to try to find balance and reason with the folks that sponsor these bills. And this is not easy when they hold the cards. Very, very difficult. And just a couple other things here. Even some of those numbers I just gave to you on planning board time, free board, everything else here, just let me give you a couple quotes from Mr. Alfred, who is here, and I'm quoting him. Bad legislation. It certainly usurps the duties and responsibilities of the planning board. The entire act should be defeated. That was the Right to Farm Act. On the shortened time for study of subdivisions, again, more and more control is being demanded by the state in terms of what we do locally. And again, Mr. Alfred, it's concerning to me because one of the provisions of the state statute is that local governments have the ability to maintain control of everything in their jurisdiction. And guess who's got control? It's not us. Thank you.
All right, is there any other comment from the public? Comment up at the table here?
I would just like to thank the planning director, Chelsea Seifer, as well as Maria Mack, the chair of the planning board, for putting in the diligence that it takes to kind of wrapping your heads around this and putting this forth and presenting it to us tonight. However, I do disagree that this is being presented at this time, right, for the sense of this should have been presented to us a month ago. The fact that this is presented to us 3 days before the new legislation is about to take effect puts it on us, puts a fire under us to pass this right away. I disagree with that procedure. I think that should have been, I think this public hearing should have been held a month ago. But again, I do appreciate the diligence that's put into this. I understand this is very complicated, and I just want to thank you for your efforts.
I just wanted to add a couple things. I want to support the passing of this, of course. I think it's important to keep control here. But what I do want to put in place personally, or from at least my council seat, is for the planning board to go back and look at the hard limit on heights. Maybe some kind of what modifications are we going to be looking at potentially going forward. I know flat roofs aren't popular, but it kind of concerns me that we're going to say you can't have a flat roof. And in my mind, if it's engineered properly and looks good, I don't think we should put that restriction on a building. But again, that's just my personal opinion when it comes to roof types. The other concerns that I have that were brought up today is when it comes to renovating of existing homes. That gets a little bit concerning as well, so I would like to be able to go back and look at that. And the biggest thing I think, or one of the biggest things, is folks that are homeowners that are kind of stuck in limbo in a way where they've started a process over time and, find out, when they go to try to pull their permit that all the plans that they have aren't going to work. So just some of the things to keep in mind, I think, as we move forward. I think it's a good idea to pass this particular ordinance right now based on timing, but I do think we should go back and do some refining of the ordinance.
I too would like to thank the planning board and the planner for helping me to understand the issue and how we as the local governing authority can keep the governing authority local. So that's where I'm headed. I do think it's important that we go back to the planning board and ask them to look at the design specs that they've laid forth and make sure that that's where we want to be, telling people what things should look like. My look like and your look like can be two entirely different animals, and I may love mine and you may love yours. So I'm a little concerned about that. I'm a little concerned about we as a town telling people what's appropriate design. Size and all of that I'm in. So I'd like to make sure that we ensure that there is some zoning path for people that have come as far as the Rudmans have come. And I would encourage them to keep moving forward with their plans and hope that we as a town can accommodate how far they've come.
Mr. President, if I may, we've been sort of puzzling through how we can help the council ensure that the suggestions that you're discussing now are actually put into effect. One possibility, it's very simple, is to sunset this. Enact this regulatory change with a sunset requiring the planning board to come back 6 months from now or what have you. Very simple provision. You could amend it here and maintain that control.
Any thoughts here at the table about a sunset provision?
I like that idea.
I'm liking it.
I think that sounds good. You suggested 6 months as...
It corresponds roughly with what we anticipate the state may do, so that was the rationale. But again, it's just a suggestion based on nothing really. It's a period of time, any period of time. I guess the question would be, what period of time is minimally necessary in order for the planning board to take this under consideration? I think that 6 weeks is probably not enough time. 6 months is, I would imagine, enough.
We do have the chair of the planning board here. I don't know if she...
Hello again, Maria Mack. I think 6 months is a very reasonable amount of time. Remember that we have a process that we need to go through, which includes a public hearing and vetting by the public participation. And I think looking at different scenarios, 6 weeks is definitely not enough time. I think having an end date is probably a very good idea.
Thank you.
Very good. So you have some language prepared for that type of amendment?
It could be, this amendment shall take effect upon passage and shall expire on September 1st, 2019. So when, if nothing else happens, then it would expire by operation of law and it would no longer have any effect. But you would, within that time, be presented with proposed amendments, so and those proposed amendments would, I assume, not have a sunset clause. So those proposed amendments would be intended to be permanent, or as permanent as anything that you pass can be.
Any comments? All right, I think that sounds like we've come up with a few good changes here. I do think it's important that we, pass this ordinance before March 1st. So at this point, do I hear a motion to close the public hearing? Unless I open it up to the public again, because we've discussed some amendments that weren't in the original agenda. Any? Okay.
I'll make a motion that we close public hearing 7B.
Second.
So moved. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And that motion carries unanimously. We have one recusal. And then do I hear a motion on 7B itself?
We need some language, don't we?
Well, I think you should reference the amendment Chelsea discussed regarding the elimination of the HFD district from the use table. That's number one. I think the suggestion on adding the word maximum on the provision governing decks, which is 601.7A5 in the copy attached to the agenda. So decks shall be no greater in size than 15% of the calculated. Then we'd insert the word maximum before GFA, gross floor area. And third, the sunset clause, providing that these amendments will take effect upon passage and shall expire on September 1st, 2019. I'm sorry, these amendments would take effect on March 1st, not tonight.
I think you can probably get away by just saying so moved.
So we ready for that? I'll move the,
And incorporate the findings from the planning board as well.
Yes.
so I will move the, I don't even know the number anymore,
7B.
7B, with the stated amendments as presented by the council, and including the sunset clause, correct? Okay. That's
I think so. Do I hear a second for that?
I'll second.
Very good. Any discussion at this point?
I feel good about the fact that we're going to put the sunset clause in there, and I'm okay with passing this to protect our local community. And in the future, I just hope that we don't end up, with only a few days to make a very important decision.
This is definitely the most complicated zoning ordinance that we've considered in my time on the council. So I want to thank all the efforts from planning department, planning board. I appreciate the concerns that were raised here tonight. I hope we've done some things to, address that. And, I think we've got a good solution for the moment. With that,
I've never been quiet for this long.
you couldn't do it the whole time, though, Joe. All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And that motion carries unanimously with one recusal. That brings us to communications. 8A is a resolution adopted January 28th, 2019 by Central Falls City Council requesting the General Assembly to enact enabling legislation that would allow cities and towns to license tobacco dealers. It's been received and placed on file. And what are we going to do with it?
Oops, sorry. Goodness.
So we talked briefly about this communication in the work session. I personally, I'm not well versed in this area of law. Apparently some cities and towns are taking it upon themselves to try and regulate tobacco sales in some form or fashion, different ways. So this, I guess, is a law that would allow us to do that more fully than is already available to us. So I guess, Amy, my question is, if communities are already doing this, why is the law necessary?
So the Central Falls Council passed a resolution requesting enabling legislation from the General Assembly because some of the efforts that other cities and towns have undertaken have been challenged in the courts, and some of those challenges have been upheld. That's the impetus for this resolution.
And how are they trying to regulate differently than the state's regulating it?
So currently, tobacco dealers are licensed by the state. As you know, cities and towns issue a variety of licenses. Everything that cities and towns license must be specifically authorized by the General Assembly. So the town can't, on its own, create a separate category of license and require applicants to go through that process. That is what some cities and towns have done. And so Central Falls is asking the General Assembly to give cities and towns specific authority to regulate tobacco retailers through a licensing mechanism.
I understand that. I guess what I'm asking you is the regulations that they're putting in place, do they differ from the state regulations?
Yeah.
Or is it just a fee? Are they looking for a $50 fee?
It is the former. The cities and towns are looking to impose additional restrictions on tobacco dealers beyond what the state requires.
I could see that getting really, really confusing.
Futile, too.
Right.
Seems futile to me, you know, I mean, we're not in the middle of, Wyoming here. If you don't like the regulation in South Kingstown, you can go a half a mile in that direction and go to Narragansett, where the regulation is different. I think it's a futile effort in this area, and I'd probably be against any kind of regulation on the part of the town's involvement in that.
I'll make a motion to put agenda item 8A, place it on file.
Second.
So moved. Any further discussion? I would personally say, I don't know if we'd consider doing this ourselves, but when we look at the fact that the state has over and over usurped power from cities and towns, it doesn't strike me as a bad thing if we try to reclaim some powers. But that being said, I don't know if this is the hill we need to plant our stake on either. So anyway, I do think, Jim's points are well taken, that we've been at the short end of the stick a lot of the time here. And, we have to find opportunities to take some power back. All right. All in favor of placing this item on file, say aye. Aye. And that motion carries unanimously. Item 8B is a communication dated February 9th, 2019, from William R. Bailey concerning the town's tax exemption programs for veterans and the elderly. It's been received and placed on file. What are we going to do with it?
So when I tried to click through this, I got a page not found. So if you could just tell us what the letter said, then we can make an informed decision.
We just noticed the dead link, too.
Yeah, that does make it. Maybe we could continue this item to.
It has come to my attention that as a 100% disabled vet, I am not entitled to my senior citizen tax exemption by virtue of the fact that my income from disability due to my injuries in Vietnam precludes me from the senior tax exemption. His letter goes on to make the assertion that he ought to be eligible for both his veterans exemption and the senior exemption.
Okay.
I personally don't see anything wrong with that, but I guess we could redirect it to the town manager to do some research and see how that would affect.
As we've discussed, we are constantly reviewing these, and we do need to figure out what the right exemption policies are as things change, as COLAs to Social Security go up. We have to make adjustments. So I will certainly talk to the tax assessor, and we'll try to figure out what best, and we'll come back to the council with a recommendation.
And also if we could have the impact, the financial impact.
Absolutely, yeah.
Estimated now.
it's going to be a relatively small number of residents.
That was my hunch, yeah.
All right, do I hear a motion on it?
I'll make a motion to place 8B on file.
And to direct the,
Oh, and to direct the town manager to investigate the implications of the proposal.
Second.
So moved. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. That motion carries unanimously. 8C is a communication dated February 19th, 2019 from Cassie Archambault, coordinator, announcing that the Wood Pawcatuck Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was received national designation, suggesting the appointment of a town representative to their stewardship council. It's been received and placed on file. And what are we going to do with this one? So we do have, this is the culmination of, it's a couple years process, maybe a year and a half. And we assigned a designee, Dennis Mignot, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He would like to continue in the role. They suggest that he should continue in the role. So I guess
I'd like to make a motion that we allow, I forget what is his last name, I'm sorry, McNeil?
I think it Migneault, Mignot.
Okay. To continue on to represent the town on the Wood Pawcatuck Wild and Scenic Rivers designation.
Mr. President, just as a point of clarification, the current role that Dennis Mignot is serving in is as a member of the study committee. What the group is contemplating is the creation of a stewardship council, and they're recommending the new position.
Correct, right.
I just want to make sure it's not just a continuation on the study committee, it's this new stewardship council.
It's like the study committee succeeded and now there's more. All right. We have a motion. Did we have a second? Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That motion carries unanimously. And that brings us to comments from interested citizens. This is your opportunity.
Good evening. Thank you. I'm going to bring you back to 8A, the communication.
Please just state your name again.
Jocelyn Leska. My specialty is family medicine, and I am in practice in South Kingstown. I would like to bring you back to the Central Falls City Council issue and discuss with you the rate of tobacco use among youth and the aggressive marketing techniques by the tobacco industry for snuff, smokeless tobacco, and vaping products. And I'd like you to think about the effect you might have in licensing tobacco products here in South Kingstown. I think that it's an opportunity for you to step out into some public health initiatives and control the excessive marketing of products towards our youth and young adults. So I'd like you to think about that issue. Perhaps I'll write a letter and ask that it be put back on the agenda for further discussion. But I would really like you to think about that because it's been an aggressive, steep climb. And we're very affected in South Kingstown by youth who smoke. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Jim O'Neill. I should have asked this question earlier, but are the Rudmans the only ones right now, if I could ask the building official, are they the only one that has a CRMC granted permit to bring to us? And why couldn't they have a variance? Why couldn't we create a variance for them?
I'll let Wayne speak to that if he's still here, but I don't know if there's any way for the town to know. I don't know, Wayne, if the town gets notice when preliminary determination applications are granted. So I don't think there's a good way for the planning department to estimate how many people have either started the CRMC application process or actually received approval from CRMC. I think we would know generally, the number of property owners who have begun discussions with us, but we may not know if there are others, like Mr. Kenyon's clients, who may be in that situation without our knowledge.
But Mr. O'Neill, to your point about a variance, as Chelsea did point out earlier, a variance may be available to them because they're not seeking the special use permit required to go under a CMRC map. Because they're trying to comply with the FEMA map, they're not using up their special use permit and therefore aren't excluding themselves from the variance.
Yeah, I just didn't know if we had a list of candidates who have checked in with your office who have to get the CRMC permitting first before they come to you for a building permit. Is it more than one? Are we looking at 10s and 20s and 30s?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we don't have a list. We're not given privy information on CRMC applications until they arrive in our office, so we don't know, and we don't know what other projects may be in the planning stages. I was just aware of their Redmonds this week when they came to my office.
Yeah, it seems a little bit of a hardship on the Redmonds to, having spent a number of years going through this, because I know that's what the other two towns, Charlestown and Narragansett, were worried about, why they passed that legislation, just to keep the permitting from not flooding their offices. That was their big concern. Second thing I had to ask, I heard DOT has got some plans for Old Tower Hill Road, either repaving, some remodeling, some combination. But how do the rest of us get to hear about this? My friends on the planning board just found out a couple of days ago, but apparently others have known for months. So how does one bring in the public? When I was on the council for 14 years, we had hundreds of people that would come with ideas just how to fix the Old Tower Hill. What do we need to do? And I just don't mean trees, but all kinds of ideas for businesses and the like. And they're just asking, how do we get to into the conversation on what's going to happen there?
Well, I mean, I'll let Rob speak to this as well, but I think at this point they're at about a 10% design phase, so that's still ample time for public input. DOT is supposed to gather public input for road reconstruction projects. I think this qualifies for that. So there will be public hearings that DOT has to undertake, and I'm pretty sure our Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee and everyone will be generating lots of public interest in those meetings. So I agree. I only found out about that last week as well. Jim?
But there were some developers that knew this 2 months ago, so I'm trying to find out why the public is not included in that conversation.
Well, I think the message is that the public will be included, and that's...
Mr. President, if I may, just a brief history. DOT did come down here about a year ago, and they walked Old Tower Hill Road with our town engineer, some folks from the planning department, and went back to DOT and started thinking about what could be done on Old Tower Hill Road. They subsequently, and I want to say 3 months ago, is that about right? When we actually got preliminary designs from them? 4 months ago. They sent back down some preliminary designs. Those were reviewed by the Transportation Committee over at the police department, the town engineer, the folks who look at all of our transportation issues here in town. It was also referred over to the Bicycle and Pedestrian Subcommittee here in town. DOT went and spoke to both of those groups and took suggestions from both of those groups, went back and sort of rehashed some very, very preliminary sketches. So Council President's correct, it's at about 10% design. It's very preliminary design at this point. And DOT is committed and has a process to ensure that the public is involved. Their process at this point is not a public hearing. It's just to sort of feel out roughly what are the objectives of the community, what is it that the history is around this stuff. They've heard from a representative from the planning board, they've heard from folks from the Bicycle Pedestrian Committee, and they're working through some designs that will be presented to the public in the future. I guess the question is, when is a project ripe for public discussion? And before the 4 months ago, there was nothing to talk about because there was nothing on paper at all. When something was put to paper, they went before the advisory committees that have been appointed by the council to give advice, and they've taken those suggestions back and have begun to put something together that will be ripe for public discussion. I'd be happy to share with the council and anyone else sort of where they are on that.
I certainly know that a lot of people I talk with would just love to have, either in the newspapers, just there will be a public hearing. Your input counts. Because I keep going back to a year and a half ago of our section on Route 1, South Route 1. And I kept waiting for notice, people kept waiting for notice, and all of a sudden we were illuminized. We have guardrails instead of the wire, some J-turns that only the residents know how dangerous they are. DOT doesn't. And a lot of trees were cut down right in front of us. And where's our notice? We never got notice. Either from DOT or the town. I don't know who's to provide that, but that was in the middle of the scenic highway designation period, but we've been after scenic highway designation for 20 years. And but just to have this all happen just almost overnight was incredible.
The Route 1 project over.
No, the Route 1 south, yep, south to Charlestown line.
Old Tower Hill Road is not going.
No, I know.
Is not going to happen overnight.
No, but I'm just saying, it's always about notice. The people just need to know what's happening.
So I will let you know that at the last meeting where DOT was in attendance, it was a meeting at the police department in the community room at the police department. My advice to, and my direction to staff was to make sure that going forward, the planning board is fully apprised of what's going on. The bicycle and pedestrian committee are fully apprised of what's going on. And we have a mechanism for ensuring that the public is fully apprised of what's going on with that DOT project.
I appreciate that, but as I said, my biggest concern was the planning board finding out a couple days ago.
Again, DOT's process at this point is very, very preliminary. It's, let's feel whether this thing
But I'm thinking about all the people in town here.
Right.
Chain of command, everyone should know what's going on.
Is there any other comment from the public? All right, at this point, any comments from council members?
I would just like to acknowledge and congratulate one of South Kingstown's residents, Jim Manny. Jim was recently selected to become the next colonel of the state police. Prior to that time, Jim served 25 years in the state police until reaching the rank of major upon retiring in 2015. Subsequent to that, he served as the Narragansett town manager. He still serves in that capacity and will serve until the end of this month before he takes effect as the new colonel of the state police on March 1. I'd like to request that the council send a citation to Jim, congratulating him and wishing him great success in this new endeavor. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. I think it would be appropriate if we could draft up a resolution congratulating Colonel Manny. Any other comments from council members? Very good. That brings us to the town manager's report.
As I mentioned last week, we're trying to change up the flag report, trying to simplify it and sort of improve it. And this is a preliminary cut at it. But these are the significant challenges that we've faced over the last reporting period, for the last 2 weeks. I have given a directive to all of the town's municipal departments to start preparing for budget reductions. That is in anticipation of this being a very tight budget cycle. The budget is scheduled to be presented to the council on Friday of this week. The proposed budget is tight, and we need to prepare for your guidance on this. So I've asked the departments to look at where we might find additional savings. I'm not delighted with it, but it is a significant challenge, and everybody's sort of going through and suffering that exercise. The form that we're using internally is being called the darn form because we didn't want to curse about it, but it's a tough one. DPS did have a sewer force main break a couple of weeks ago, and that has caused construction to happen out at Route 138, and that also has been a significant challenge. We still have concerns around the food truck ordinance, and we anticipate that we're going to have something for the council before July 1, but it is not as straightforward a problem as we wish. Marijuana legalization, this is an issue that has some challenges all its own. Essentially, the problem we are facing, or that we're possibly confronted with, is that the governor has proposed the legalization of recreational marijuana. The scheme that has been presented would require municipalities to opt out of the recreational marijuana regime. If you don't pass a referendum locally, then you're in. So we'd have to do a referendum this fall in order to opt out. That's a big undertaking, and we're concerned about it. Just now beginning to plan for how to present that to the council and how we would deal with that. And this is not the place or the time because this is just the manager's report, but if the council were inclined to not worry about opting out, that might save us some trouble, but we are certainly beginning to plan for an ordinance or a referendum opting out of legalized marijuana. It may also go away if the state legislature makes clear that they're not going to entertain an opt-out state statute. We still have challenges around the streetlight program. There was a lawsuit that changed the way that the traffic lights or street lights are dealt with in the state. State lights are now owned by the state, and they are the ones who are responsible for maintaining them. We had entered into we had actually been authorized to enter into a contract to purchase replacements, LED replacements for the street light innards. And 30% of the streetlights that we anticipated are actually owned by the state, so we're sort of hung up there. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. We're waiting for further guidance from the state and National Grid. Munis upgrade, just a standard systems upgrade, but whenever you're dealing with a critical system like Munis, it is a challenge for us. Building and zoning, we have always got a large number of property maintenance complaints that Wayne is dealing with. We are going to be coming to the council with an ordinance on dumpsters. We've talked about this before. We're getting close to having an ordinance before the planning board. Is that right? Planning board?
Yes, it was scheduled to be discussed at the work session on the 12th, but that was postponed due to weather.
Okay. So once we've got a recommendation from the planning board, that's coming your way. On the successes or anticipated successes, Lori Fox has been asked to serve as a member of the advisory committee for Vision as they're rewriting their application. That's a pretty big deal for an IT director because that's a pretty important information.
And Vision is the appraisal?
It's the appraisal software, that's correct. And GIS has organized last week a very informative presentation by a vendor who's offering a potentially earth-shattering, really, application that we could integrate into all of our operations. So we saw a presentation on an amazing GIS system that could make a big difference. And our emergency communications project is progressing. The review of proposals is scheduled, well, interviews for proposers are scheduled for tomorrow. So that program or that project is continuing apace. Just to give you a sort of highlight of what, or a foreshadowing of what I'm hoping that we can build into the reports going forward, rather than the simple red, green, yellow presentation. I'm really trying to get us focused on presenting to the council some data, some numbers, and sort of high-level descriptions of what's going on around Town Hall, and then sort of describe as well the operational objectives and goals that we've achieved in the 2-week reporting period, and how that data and those goals or those issues that we've encountered affect the long-term operations of the Town Hall. And that is a report.
Thank you. Solicitor's report.
Council members, before the meeting began, I distributed a document, a memorandum dated February 25th, 2019. That's a revised version of the memo that was sent to you last week, I believe on Thursday, the 21st. You do have a clean copy and a red line copy. The document relates to agenda item 8C from your February 11th council meeting regarding a communication from Sarah Markey. You don't need to take any action at this point, because the action that was taken on February 11th was directing the solicitor's office to draft the correspondence that was distributed.
Thank you. All right, and that brings us to appointments. Do you have any? Okay. Looks like there's a reappointment. Oh, we're waiting for response. Okay. Well, very good. We'll move on to new business. Item 13A is a resolution authorizing transmittal of the 2019 Hazard Mitigation Plan update to the Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency and Federal Emergency Management Agency for approval. Any questions, or do I hear a motion on this?
I'll make a motion that we approve item 13A.
Second?
So moved. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. That motion carries unanimously. 13B is a resolution authorizing the town manager to proceed with publicly advertising a request for proposal for the purchase of the municipally owned property located at 274 Waits Corner Road, designated as Assessor's Plat 22-1, Lot 45, and further described in a memo from the Director of Leisure Services to the town manager. Hi, Terry.
Good evening. Terry Murphy, Director of Leisure Services. Just as a bit of background, the property at 274 Waits Corner Road, otherwise known as Oliver Watson property, is owned by the town, was gifted to the town in 1939. It's been vacant since 1997. We are interested in moving along the sales process for this property and proposing that an RFP be advertised for proposals for the public sale of this property.
Where is public advertising? Just in the local paper, or is this going to be a bigger advertising?
Actually, it's a good question. We hadn't devised an advertising strategy as of yet. But the wider we can cast our net, the better. So we will look for opportunities to get it online and get word out as far as we can.
Thank you. All right. Do I hear a motion on 13B?
Motion to approve 13B.
Second.
So moved. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. And that motion carries unanimously. 13D is a resolution endorsing the State Transportation Improvement Program. I'm not going to go through the trouble of reading it. Do I hear a motion?
I'll make a motion that we approve item 13D.
Second.
So moved. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
That motion carries unanimously. Look forward to the tip happening. And that takes us to the end of the agenda. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
So moved. All in favor say aye. Aye. That carries unanimously. And the time is 9:35.
this article.